welcome to the launch of Armenians of Calcutta, a book of photos, archive and text by Alakananda Nag. We are going to have 3 parts to the evening, and I'm going to be moderating proceedings. So this is how we will go about it. First, we are going to have a presentation by the author. After that, we are going to have a small panel discussion. So, if I can just welcome Alka to the panel to start.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. It's a Tuesday evening, so thanks really for taking the time out. Thank you, Goethe Institute, Maximum Archival, Kolkata. This is your first in-person event post-COVID, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thanks to the Armenian community for being here. Thanks to the stellar panel that I have here today. It's really wonderful to have all of you, and thanks, Courtney, for agreeing to moderate this. Before I start, I would just like to mention 2 people who were very key to this book, to my mind, Abhi Sen and Professor Hari Vasudevan. Most of you here know them or know of them. And unfortunately, we lost them both to COVID. And I wish so much that they were here today. Okay. So everyone here in this room knows that there was an Armenian presence in Calcutta. But the degree to which we know about the specificity of the history may vary. I started on a search to know more almost 12 years ago. A slow unraveling of a vast history. Am I okay now? Yeah, okay. A slow unraveling of a vast history that we may often tend to forget. This is not a history book. It's a book of photographs, archive, and text about the community and my experiences with them. Let me start with this bit of detail. This building, this very building where we are right now, Park Mansions, was built by an Armenian, Thaddeus Mesrop-Thaddeus, merchant and philanthropist in 1910. But this is not the only building built by an Armenian. All of Park Street, literally like Stephen Court, Queen's Mansion, as we know, Harrington Mansions, Rawdon Street, Loudon Street, Pretoria Street, the list is endless actually. So many hotels that are favorite haunts of the city. I mean, J.C. Galston alone built 300 buildings, I think, Shantanu, and then I think he lost them all, something like that. But that was another time. I will take you back to my high school. So it was a high school party, disco lights, smoke rings, classic rock blaring from large speakers, and lots of dancing. My memory of that night is sketchy, as is the memory of many other events from high school. But I remember clearly a striking boy sipping Coca-Cola. He looked different, standing all by himself in a corner. He disappeared just as quickly as he showed up in the dimly lit rooftop party. A friend mentioned he's Armenian. That was the first time I encountered an Armenian in Calcutta. That was late 90s. I first started photographing the Armenian community in January 2010. I didn't know much about their history, and it was curiosity that led me to them. As a city, we know about and interact with other communities, the Jews, for instance, the Anglo-Indians, the Chinese, but the Armenians are somewhat hard to come by. Not anymore for me though, Mari's right here. And this absence of material presence or physical interaction led me to look into their lives. I met the kinds of people I would otherwise not meet, interact with, share tea and cake with. The very people who were part of the fabric of my city, and I was ignorant of what they brought to our history and social milieu. The first Christian grave, annotated 1630, is that of an Armenian, Riza Bibi, We will get into the details slightly later in the talk. But 1630 is interesting because Job Charnock came here in 1690. So it can, they were clearly here much before the British. The first church of Calcutta, 1724, in Marabazar, they built so much of the city. They traded so skillfully. They built schools, they worked in offices, owned coal mines in Asansol and in Dhanbad. They ran shellac factories in Jhalda. They owned ships for trading. It was alive and thriving. My challenge was how to photograph the community now. Let me read an excerpt from the book about my experience. The peepal tree was my landmark. After much meandering, I found it. It led into what seemed like plunging into a sea of people, shops, stalls, carts, bicycles, boxes, more people, and so many things. This is the Colour Dye Street. Shops untidily hemming both sides, too narrow, too busy for uninterrupted walking. This is also Armenian Street. Nothing like what I had imagined. I walked through a formidable wooden door, easily 20 feet tall. At this door, the city mutated, and I stepped into what lay beyond. This was Armenian Street. And the next section goes on to, while I'm inside there, the noise, the chaos, the city dissolved, left behind at the periphery in silent rebellion. The transformation is hardcore and disorienting, evocative of an unknown feeling of deep diving into a time capsule. A pristine steeple, a dazzling white church, a worker sweeping dry mango leaves off tombstones paving the ground. A guard took me into the office. A life-size portrait of Sir Patrick Paul Chater hung on the wall. Mr. Mitra, member of the church committee, part Bengali, part Armenian, assured me permission to photograph. I took a little tour before leaving. I spotted the tomb of Riza Bibi. The Holy Church of Nazareth, Calcutta's oldest church, houses Calcutta's oldest Christian grave. Holy Church of Nazareth, oldest church of Calcutta. So there was this wonder of walking into another world. In hindsight though, photographing the first couple of years was comparatively easy, even though at the outset I didn't think so. I was documenting everything from, portraits to rituals to spaces. Photographs like these were very early photographs that I took. But after a couple of years, I was very dissatisfied and I took some time off from the work. And that's when I realized that simply photographing was not enough. That I was not just documenting, I was trying to unravel a history in my own way that had ceased to be part of public memory, discourse, and visual culture. I started looking for more material, and I was struck by the absence. I was both fascinated and bothered by it. Sure, there's quite a lot of information in the British Library or in the US libraries on the same subject, but I was interested in what was left behind, the unanswered questions, the gaps. I had made my periphery very limited because I wanted to stay with what is available in Calcutta. This challenge I was willing to take to look at the community and the book from a different lens, not discounting the urgency because the community is fast disappearing. The Armenians were never large in number, maybe 1,000, 1,200. Shantanu, what do you think? Maybe in their... Yeah?
At the heydays.
At the heydays, exactly. Otherwise, they were always about 400 to 600, I would imagine. But they were very, very important members of the community. So, and with every discovery, like for me, like everything was like a treasure trove, and with every discovery, I was getting more and more intrigued. So, Paul Chater, for instance, those from the Martinia would maybe have heard of the Paul Chater. We sang of Paul Chater in our school anthem, but didn't really know about the history till recently. So Paul Chater was an orphan and an alumnus of La Martinia. He left Calcutta at the age of 18, only to become the father of modern-day Hong Kong. He also helped the school monetarily when it was at a point of closure, and therefore he became the benefactor of La Martinière. Arakan Stephen, who came from Isfahan, sold jewelry in a wheelbarrow through these very streets. And then he became so wealthy, he built the Grand Hotel, the Stephen Court, the Stephen House in Dalhousie, the Everest Hotel in Darjeeling. J.C. Galston, the famous J.C. Galston, also known as the Great Galston, developer, horse owner, punter. It is said he built over 300 buildings and lost them all. And then not to forget the diva, Gohar Jan, the first Indian to record on a 78 RPM shellac disc. She too was of Armenian origin. This photograph actually is very interesting because this is from the collection of Rontidev Moithro, who unfortunately is not here today, I think. But he told me that the only disciple of Gohar Jan gifted him this photograph. So it's really not available anywhere. I literally took the photo off of his wall. Historically speaking, there were other very interesting objects that I happened to find. This book, for instance. I found this quite by chance in the library of the Armenian College. This discovery surprised me just as much as it surprised everybody in the school. No one knew it was hiding behind other big books. But this book was a treasure trove of information of the people who studied in the college for 50 years, including Mari's father, Mari sitting right here. But it was impossible to put all that information because it was so interesting where they came from, because most of these students had come from Iran and Baghdad and Armenia. And a lot of the information, even in the book, was missing, like roll numbers were missing. So it was very, very fascinating to go through the book. So yeah, I couldn't put everything, but I kind of did a compromise where I put the photographs out like this in the book. Then again, a very, very interesting find one day when I was in the Asiatic Society, and I came across this article in Bengal, past and present. I will just read this. This is the epitaph of the photograph we saw of the first grave of Kolkata, Christian grave. This is the tomb of Riza Bibe, the wife of the late charitable Sukias, who departed from this world to life eternal on the 26th day of Nakha in the year 15, i.e. on the 21st July 1630. What a world of questions is suggested by this newly found record. Why was the source of information never utilized before? Who was the charitable Sukias? And how did his family come to be living in Calcutta 60 years before the advent of the English? Was there already an Armenian settlement here? Are the Armenians, after all, the founders of the city? Khoja Israel Sarat, Bengal, past and present, 1936. Next, again, a very, very interesting find. In fact, Professor Hari Vasudevan directed me toward this, which is a classical Armenian question paper of Calcutta University from 1932. I really did not even know, but it's very interesting because clearly there were enough students who would sit for these exams and give exams in classical Armenian, and I wonder if there were any Indians sitting for these exams. I'm not sure. This, again, from the collection of Rontidev Moithro, which is one of the first shellac records that Gohar Jan recorded on. This one is the first dancing girl from 1902. This one is from the collection of Shobhik Roy, collector. He's right here with us today, thank you. These are matchbox covers, and she was very, very popular. So she was on several matchbox covers. In fact, Joduna Pavan also has this in the archive. This is one of my favorites. This is actually from a page from the Register of Baptism at the church, main church. And this is a register which is a massive, massive register. And they have had the same register since 1904. It says a lot about the population of Armenians in the city. But very important in all this archive is Mari Stephen, who is with us today, she's on the panel, her family archive. So while I was struggling with finding information, Mari was really the only one who had very, very lovingly preserved her family albums and a lot of other ephemera, which I actually used in the book. And I digitized a lot of her work, her albums, and it's fascinating. Of course, it was impossible to put everything, but we have everything digitized. That's great. These are Murray's parents. This is her father's passport. And this is her family photograph. So at first it was very hard to make sense of all this scattered information. Intense conversations with my mentor, Dayanita Singh, paved the way. Also, in a conversation with Tapatidi and Professor Hari Vasudevan, they both suggested to me to think perhaps of some key elements by which to work on the progression of the book. All of this was very helpful, but the dilemma was real and hanging over me of misinterpretation, of saying perhaps too much or too little. I made and I unmade the book several times, and it was exhausting at some point. But finally, the book deals in three main elements, that is architecture, purity of blood, and the people. Under this umbrella, varied media come together, including photographs, archive, text, and ephemera, to make this tactile document of the Calcutta Armenians. And this is the Armenians of Calcutta. Thank you.
So before we start on our discussion, I would like to introduce everybody on the panel. My name is Porni Ray, and I will be moderating, as Alka mentioned. So first, Alka already mentioned about Murray, but I would like to formally introduce her now. And Murray Stephen and her brother Sako is here.
Yeah, Sapo's here. Sapo just started out. Sapo's get up. It's like an elder sister.
Murray and her brother Sako's parents were survivors of the Armenian Genocide. They met and married in Jerusalem. Yes. And later settled in Calcutta. Until recently, Murray worked at the Assembly of God Church School.
The church.
And her family albums, which we saw a little bit of, was kept and preserved by Murray for a very long time, and it is one of the highlights of the book. Second, we have Chatru Shengupta, Assistant Professor of History at Olba Mahavidyalaya. His doctoral research focused on the formation of the British Empire in Eastern Indian Ocean and the Armenian Agency from mid 18th to early 19th century. Yael Silverman is an author, scholar, women's rights activist. She's written extensively on gender and economic development, as well as the Jewish community in Calcutta. And she is also the author of Jewish Portraits, Indian Frames, Women's Narratives from a Diaspora of Hope. Finally, we have Professor Tapati Mutakurata. She is Professor of History and former Director of the Center for Studies in Social Science, Calcutta. She has written widely about art and cultural history of modern India, and since 1996 has been in charge of building a digital visual archive of the CSSC. Thank you all for joining us, and a very warm welcome to you. Hopefully we'll have a great discussion. Before we start, however, I'm going to start with you, Alka, regarding your presentation. So, what I wanted to know first is, this is a book which has a lot of photography. It's clear that photography is the primary medium in it, yet you seem to not ever call it a photo book. Why?
Yeah, I was actually very apprehensive because although I'm trained as a photographer, but I always kind of felt that photography, I think especially after photography, documentation became so everyday. I think for me, photography became a point of departure and a starting point for other things really. And I do have to say that reading Danika Singh a lot and also a lot of interaction with Abhi, I think that there was a kind of freedom to stop thinking that I'm a photographer. And I think once that happened, the world kind of opened up for me for really looking at other things, because we get very stuck, especially documentary photographers, and I should photograph everything. And I was doing exactly that the first, a few years that I started photographing the community. But then this discomfort happened. I spoke about, staying away from the work in the talk. And it was probably a good year or so that I stayed away. And it was, and I think now when I see it, I think it was, kind of an urgent thing to do, an important thing to do, to not make it purely a book of just photos.
So in that case, what role does photography play in your book, and who are you? What is your role? I
don't know. I think we were having this discussion yesterday, and you said that, am I making the photograph, or what was
I said, are you making the photographs, or are you finding images?
Or am I finding? And it's a really interesting question. I don't really have the answer, but I think I would veer towards still making, because I think it's a choice, it's a decision that we're always making. So, but yeah, in the larger sense, I really don't have an answer for you right now. I don't know. I think it's evolving.
So, given that you are in many ways, in quotes, an outsider kind of looking in, and there's so much nostalgia around the book, you've got a lot of, how do you process that given that your position is so kind of liminal?
Yeah, so I was very worried, and when I started out, and I'll go back to those first few years when I was photographing, I was ticking off all the boxes. So when I stayed away, I realized that I was exoticizing, my subjects, the spaces, because this was all very new for me. And that, to my mind, was very dangerous for the work and obviously for the community. And that's why I think the work took so long, because I had to really understand, and there was this big problem of, representation, because I did not want to speak for the community at all. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
To some extent. Marie, do you remember the first time you met her?
Well, I think it was in the Armenian church. It was the Armenian Christmas or something.
We don't remember.
Yes, so many years ago.
How many years ago was it?
12 years? 12 years, yeah. It must have been the Armenian Christmas, which is on the 6th of January. So we all go to church, the Holy Church of Nazareth in Brabant Road. Then she came, she approached us, and she spoke to us. She said, I'm a photojournalist. I want to write about the Armenian community in Calcutta. So can I come to your house and take some photographs and talk with you and all that? So I said, you're most welcome. So she came with her tripod and her camera, and it was like a AK-47. She was only shooting. She went to all the rooms and made us pose and all that.
How did you feel about it?
It was good. And next to a window, then a sitting room, a dining room, a bedroom, both the bedrooms. So it was like a AK-47 shooting. But then eventually she put it on in the papers, in the Telegraph. And first the BBC, yes, the BBC. And like how I was telling you earlier, that I was walking down Park Street, and then two young guys, they passed me. And then suddenly, both of us, we looked at each other at the back, like the guy and myself. And then he said, excuse me, are you an Armenian? I said, yes, how do you know? So he said, I saw you on BBC. He was in England or where he was, I don't know. So he was with another friend, he was French. And then we started talking, and he turned out to be half Armenian. His mother was Armenian, his father was, I think, Arab or something like that, I can't remember. But they live in France or England, something like that, yeah. So, and then when photo came out in the newspapers. All my friends sent me WhatsApp and all that. Told me, you and your brother in the papers. You and your brother in the papers. Anyway,
So when did you share your family albums with her?
oh, I think it was on the first day or the second time.
Albums were later.
Okay, later. And she was so happy when I brought out my family albums, and I showed them to my mommy and daddy's wedding photographs. They got married in Jerusalem. And so I showed the photographs and the passports, my mommy's passport, my daddy's passport, my granny's passport, my father's mom. She was interested in everything, literally everything she was interested, And then I told her about our family history. Actually, my great-grandparents from my mother's side, they were the victims of the genocide, the Armenian Genocide. This was way back, I think in 1915. And they were killed and all that. But my grandmother, my mommy's mother, she was a survivor. She was a 10-year-old girl. And these Kurds they call it, in Armenians say Kurds. They came and they took my grandmother away from her mother. And so she was so disappointed. And she committed suicide. She jumped into the river. Like a lot of Armenian ladies, I believe, they committed suicide after all their families. Yes, after their families were all killed or taken away, and So anyway, so this little girl, somehow she was brought up by Turkish family, but they were very good family, very good. So they looked after her like her own daughter and all that, like their own daughter. But when it was time for her to get married, they get married early 1560, they wanted to marry my granny to their son. And being Muslims, so because my great-grandmother told her, whatever you do, don't marry a Muslim. Because the milk that I've given you will be haram. Because like that it was, So that was in her mind. So anyway, so she was so worried what to do. Then she was in the garden, I don't know what she was doing. And then one American lady, she was going and quietly saying, are you an Armenian? Are you an Armenian? And then she said, yes. Are you happy here? She said, yes, I'm happy. Then, you want to run away? So she said, oh, then she told her what was going to happen, like they want to marry me to their son and all that, though they are nice people. So we say, anyway, if you want, there's an orphanage close, like she gave the direction, and you have to go to the forest. So she took the chance. She ran away, she went to the forest, and in the forest, one hunter came, and she was so frightened, she thought that this hunter will rape her or something like that. But this hunter said, don't worry, my daughter, you sleep there, I will sleep here, don't worry, I won't do anything. And in the middle of the night, one wolf came. And this hunter, I think he was an angel, he must have been an angel. The hunter got up, shot the wolf, and then after he disappeared. He disappeared. Then after some time my granny slept, the next morning she carried on. Then she ate all those wild berries from the trees and all that. She got sick, her stomach was swollen, and somehow she managed to reach this orphanage. They looked after her and all that. So when it was marriageable age, they matched it with the other boys and girls. Then they went and settled in Jerusalem. I think they were originally from Sepastia, that's in Armenian, isn't it? Vache? Yes. Sepastia, yeah. Yes. So originally they were all from Armenia, So they settled in Jerusalem. My grandfather was a tailor, and my grandmother was, she had 7 children. So,
She finally came to stay in Calcutta, right?
No, my mother was, this is my grandmother, okay. They had 7 children, so my mom was one of them. So my father, his story is, he was born in Baghdad. And during the First World War, his father was killed in the war. And then my granny, she was expecting her second child, but the baby was still in her stomach. And she was trying all kinds of things to abort the child. In those years, abortion was a no thing, So, in those days they would carry heavy things, they push heavy things for the child to fall. But nothing happened of that sort, So my auntie was born. 2 years difference between my father and my father was 2 years old. So somehow she managed to struggle and bring up the children. Then she heard about the Armenian community in Calcutta, my granny from my father's side. She heard about the Armenian community in Calcutta, so she decided to come to India. And those years, no plane, no passport, no visa, no terrorism.
So the sheriff had written a letter for them?
Yes, so what happened, the sheriff of the town wrote a note and saying that Mrs. So-and-so, the wife of late Mr. So-and-so, with her 2 children and the names and the ages were given, is leaving for India and we wish her all the best. And they bought the ticket, the boat ticket or the ship ticket, and they landed in Bombay. Then in Bombay also there's an Armenian church, big Armenian community. Those years they were all in thousands. The Armenian community was all in thousands. So somehow I don't know what my granny did. I think she was a seamstress or something like that. Then she heard about the Calcutta school, Armenian college. It's a school but they call it college. And it was only for boys in those years, And my auntie went to Pratt Memorial School, which is near St. James's Church and School. So they were brought up here. My father was 8 years old and my auntie was 6 years old. Then they grew up here. Then my father, he went for a tour to the Middle East. He went to Jerusalem. He had an Armenian guide, and the guide took him to all the places. Then there was one American hospital, and most of the nurses were Armenians, most of them. And when they were just admiring the building or whatever, the nurses, the student nurses or whatever, they came up 2 by 2 and they were going into their bus to go home. Then my father's eye fell on my mother. And said, who are you? And he asked the guide, who's an Armenian, they know each other over there. Who's that girl on the second row on the left side or whatever? They were going to So they said, half of Sahagyan's daughter, second daughter. Her name is Varthanush. My father's name was Vahan. Vahan in Armenian means shield. And Varthanush means sweet rose. So so then after Hapov Sahagyan's daughter, is she married? No, she's not married. Take me to their house. I want to propose to her. It was love at first sight. So they went, and my grandparents didn't know my father from Adams. They didn't know who he was and all. He just went and said, I want to marry your daughter. And they said, okay. See, they say marriages are made in heaven. So this marriage was made in heaven. So then anyway, but my father said, I have to go back to work in Calcutta. I'm from Calcutta. I have to go back to work. My leave is finishing. But please keep her. Next year, definitely I'm coming. I'll bring my mother, who's in Calcutta, India. I'll bring my mother and we are going to get married. I'll marry your daughter, Varthanush. So he kept his word, he took his mother and they had a very grand wedding with so many Armenian bishops and priests and whatnot.
You have pictures of this in the book from the album as well.
And then they came back, they came to India and we were 7 of us, we were born in Calcutta. But out of 7 children, 4 babies died while teething time they died. So I've got an elder sister, you saw that picture, the older one is my sister Angela. Yes, and the smaller one is me, And then I've got a brother, Sarkis. He's 8 years younger to me, yes. And he's a freelance journalist. Yes.
Yeah, I quickly want to come to you. How much of this reminds you of your archive, and if you could tell us a little bit about the archive as well.
It's on. Hello, can you hear me? The story is different because it seems like the Armenian community that you're talking about had come to India in the 1940s, 1950s. But my family goes back much earlier. My ancestor was the first Jew to come to Calcutta. He came from Surat in 1797. And it's interesting, he was from Aleppo in Syria. And when they were religious, they were conservative. And the first synagogue that they had, which is near the Navy Shalom in Calcutta, they rented from an Armenian. And they used the space, and later then in 1824, 26, I'm bad at dates, they built their synagogue of their own. So Jews and Armenians were much earlier than the Jews. They came much earlier. But the story that you were sharing with us, Mali, is about people who came more recently. So my family is older, but it's interesting because we come from the same part of the world. And when she was talking about Jerusalem and the marriage there, I'm very familiar with the Armenian Quarter in Jerusalem, and I know that. And when I grew up, actually Calcutta was, I'm 66, so grew up in 1955. We had Armenians in our school, and I didn't know, it was a shock to me reading your beautiful book, that there were only 1,000 Armenians in Calcutta, because for me their presence was all over the place. And my brother was a rugby player, okay? So Armenians were fantastic in rugby. Yes. And the whole Armenian team was there. So yeah, so when I think of Armenians, I thought there were a lot of them, because they were very visible in my life. And I live across the street from La Martiniere, and the CESC box has Mr. Chater on it. And my parents had a lot of Armenian friends as well. So we were very familiar with Armenians. I was surprised because we were 4,000 in number, the Jewish community. Went up to 5,000 at the peak in about 30s or 40s. And I thought the Armenian community was at least as big as us, or bigger, but it turns out that we're not. And we have a lot of similarities. We come from the same part of the world. And I just wanted to mention about Gohar Jahan, because I created an archive on the Jewish community. Unlike you, Alaka, I was an insider, but not really an insider, because I grew up in a very different non-Jewish Calcutta. I went to Loreto House, which was a cosmopolitan school. I had a cousin in my class, Michelle Ladi, maybe somebody know Gabby Ladi. There were a few Jewish girls in the school. I didn't go to the Jewish girls' school. And by the time I grew up in the 70s, there were very few Jews left in Calcutta. There were 600 or 700 Jews, and every year they were diminishing in number. In fact, I never went to a Jewish wedding. The last Jewish wedding was in 1984. Because as soon as people got marriageable age, the parents started getting nervous, who are they going to marry? There's so few Jews in Calcutta, what are we going to do? And they would disappear. They'd be sent to Israel, to Jerusalem, to London, to Canada, wherever. And so I never really saw a Jewish wedding. So even though I was an insider, which helped in some ways, because I too found the material presence in Calcutta was very little. That you could take pictures of buildings and homes and a few people, but really I gathered the most information from around the world. And my archive really, when I looked at the photographs, they were very much like photographs in the archive. When you talk about the school diaries and the pictures, they're very similar to other schools of the time. They were all very similar. So everything seems so familiar to me. So though I was an insider, I had to get my information from outside, from the diaspora, which is really what gave me a sense of the Jewish presence, because really there's so little left here today. So yeah, stop there.
Shantanu, I want to quickly come to you about, since we have had quite a few conversations about absence in material, and Alka also mentioned that she wanted to, kind of have a boundary around her research so that it only focused on Calcutta. What is your experience, since you are an institutional historian? What is your experience with regard to finding material?
Well, firstly, I work with people who are long dead. So I look at the archives, and frankly speaking, the West Bengal State Archive doesn't hold much on the Armenians. Most of the material has been transferred off to the National Archives of India and also abroad to the British libraries. But it's not that the Armenians are not there. Actually, they're everywhere in Calcutta. You cannot really go around Calcutta without encountering the presence of the Armenians there.
Is this something that you realized only after you started researching or before?
No, I mean, from your childhood, when you come from Howrah towards Fairley, you have to come across the Armenian Ghat launch, right? I stay in Dum Dum, so I often went around the Sukia street. I heard from my father that the Kashipur Uttanbati had been at one point of time had been rented on a lease of 90 years by an Armenian who just gave it away. so that the disciples of Ramakrishna Dev could visit the place. So you cannot really go around Calcutta without like encountering the Armenians in that way. But my encounter with them institutionally, as you say, was in a very different way in the archives of Madras and in the archives of Delhi. So it is there that I encountered with the Armenians that I work around, who are long dead.
And what would you say, since we heard from Marie, and I feel like compared to the period that you look at, like you said, they're long dead, and by long you mean a century, more than that. What is your notion of the heydays of the Armenians in Calcutta? If you could give us like a snapshot of what it would look like.
See, the Armenians, as I saw them in the 18th century or the end of the 17th century, had these two very interesting tenets about them. One, they were extremely pluralistic. You know, that's what made Calcutta possible, because it was because Israel Sarhad was trustworthy to both Azimuth Shah and also to Sorman. So, you know, that's one very important thing that happened. And Calcutta was like that. If you look at the landscape of Bada Bazaar, there's this Church of Nazaret, thronged by the synagogue. There's a Portuguese church in front, and in the violence you enter, you get into a giant temple, and you go back, you find out a Shia Khanqa. So, you know, yeah, right, the Parsi-Pai temple, right. So, you know, that's the landscape. So that's when the Armenians started walking. So, when I encountered the Armenians in the archives, what fascinated me about them was that they were working with every other community, yet they were able to maintain an extremely cohesive structure, a network, as we call it in our way of working. How did they do that? And that's very evident. They invested in institutions. They invested in the language. They invested in the school. They invested in the church. They invested in the gravestones. I find the gravestones extremely interesting. Every gravestone in all the Armenian churches are basically archival material. You can actually draw back genealogies through the gravestones. My favorite one is not in Calcutta, unfortunately. It's there in Chinsura Church. The one that belonged to Beglarov or Beglarian. That's how I came across this whole notion that Alexander Cunningham's assistant is lying down there, and not only that he was a part of the ASI, he worked this, but the gravestone also talks about his ancestry back in the Nagorno-Karabakh. That is the fascinating part about the Armenian gravestones. And a lot of things, the print culture, etc. So they have made a mark about themselves, and you know, that is fascinating. When I came across Hovhannes Avdal's census report of 1815, it talks about around 444 Armenians in Calcutta, but at the same point of time, he also talks about a community of Haiko Indians. Now, Hai comes from Hastan, as people would know this. That's how Armenians would call their nation, their country. That was taught to me by my teacher sitting there, Mr. Vachagam Talagosian. He opened up the world of the living Armenians to me, otherwise I would have been only working with dead people. So that part again is fascinating. So probably we don't, while we look at the cohesiveness, we look for true blood, we look for pure blood. We also don't look at the assimilation that they had made possible. So that probably is another way of working through it and finding out how the 18th or 19th century cosmopolitanism of Calcutta lives through till now.
This is also something that you were talking about, even during your time, you know, the multicultural Calcutta that you and Marie kind of like witnessed,
But I also think it's really interesting to hear what he says, because that's very similar for the Jewish community. We invested in institutions, we invested in schools. The Jewish Girls School was one of the earliest schools in the city. We invested in hospitals, very philanthropic as well. we were very similar, and we also were people of the book, so everything was really well documented. What's really sad is when they left, we don't know where those documents have gone. So they're not in Calcutta, they're all over the world, and like you said, British Library, other libraries as well. So I think there were a lot of similarities between us, and we also had a lot of Armenian, Parsi, Hindu, Muslim friends. That was part of our milieu. But like them, we were very conservative in that marrying out was, many people did marry out, but it was, we didn't talk about those people. Okay, that was not okay. We were the bad girls. I was one of those as well. Or they were in movies or film, but we didn't talk about that. Good Jewish girls weren't supposed to be Hindi film stars and definitely not Bengali film stars, but they were. You know, so there were a lot of things that were silences that we didn't talk about. We were also very assimilated, but still, we were culturally conservative. And like you, the church or the synagogue was an extremely important institution for us. It was a social place where we got together. It was a place where religious worship was done. It's where marriages were made. It was where every birth was recorded. It was really the center of the cultural life of the Jewish community and kept us as a cohesive community.
Right. You did mention that the church was very significant. You also met
And we have a club also.
Oh, right.
Yes, we have the Borough Club, which is in Queen's Mansion. We have the Borough Club, which is in Queen's Mansion. And we have the Sports Club next to the Parsi Club at Mayor Road. So I remember when we were small children, Christmas time, Armenian Christmas time, we would have the tea party in the Sports Club. And we would, followed by fancy dress. Our parents would dress.
I have to say, you guys mentioned lots of parties, which I feel really like we missed out on.
Those days there were lots of Armenians. We only grew up among the Armenians. I had no Indian friends before, you know. Then later on, in my teens, late teens, then I started having Indian friends.
I want to say something about the fancy dress, and it's interesting because Mari's sister was dressed as a Punjabi girl in a fancy dress party. I found that very, very interesting.
She also dressed as Miss World. And I was Sapo, my brother was a Russian boy. He was a small 2-year-old child, you know. And I was NCC. I remember one of my costumes was NCC. Like these different things we had, you know, fancy dress. Then we would get first prize, second prize, third prize. Then the Father Christmas would come in the horse and carry, you know, with his balloons and all that. And then he would get gifts. Then the trickster would come, the magician, and then he would say, focus, 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 focus. And he would have a jar of water, he would pour it, focus, focus. And the water would finish, then he would do like, again the water would come. Then he would have a pigeon, he had something, he would, he would burn it, he would open and a pigeon would come out and all that, you know. Then we would have, followed by dance. Of course, the snacky and all that.
I think that still exists because when I was a kid.
Yeah, but this year we didn't have, this year we didn't have because of the COVID, yes. And then there was followed by dance, that was the last item, or Armenian dancing we would do. You know, we would, that curtain would come down because after 6 the clubs were not allowed to, I don't know what, but there was that thick curtain would come down and we would dance away, you know. So that's
Professor Gotaputa, I wanted to kind of circle back to the question of images with you. And what I wanted to ask is, in the book, what I found interesting when I first read it is that there was this interesting mix of both present-day pictures and also archival images, found images, etc. And given that this was, I guess it's fair to call like a personal research project, in what way do you think images, not just archival ones, but also images which are being taken at present, which means that especially if you are in quotes outsider and you're taking pictures, there is a subject-object position which comes in. What role can photography or images play in this sort of a research project?
I think Alakananda already talked a bit about that. So I'll come into it from a slightly different angle. To say that it is around an image seen on a computer screen that I first met Alakananda It was in our archives on the top floor of the Jodhanath Bhavan Museum and Resource Center. She had wanted to meet me and I came, and it was a matchbox labeled poster of Gohar Jan that I remember very vividly on the screen that she was looking at and asking how she could get a copy of it for it. And that's our first meeting. So I'll begin there because I think I came to know her, and I'll come back to the image question if I could briefly digress there. I think I came to know her at a moment when she had already done a lot of photography and had withdrawn to take stock again of where this work was going. I think she herself was then moving between documenting lives and people, so far as she found them, families and memories, to also thinking a bit about what remained, which was very little, and how does one as an outsider, but also as somebody who, as Shantanu said, has lived with things Armenian. So I'm not a specialist. I think I must be the only one in this panel who have not really either part of the community nor have really worked on it. So that was one of the points at which I met Alakananda, and so she started talking to me about the possibility of my being a part of her book. And I kept saying, but I'm not a specialist, I do not know really enough on this. And that's where I think I introduced her to my husband, Hari Vasudevan, who took a huge interest in this, partly because he was a specialist on Russia, but he also got interested then of all the communities around Russia. And so that was in a way a fortuitous contact. And I think Alakananda's research then grew in different directions with Hari as the person in main conversation. So I'm here really, I kept thinking of that, I'm here as a very poor substitute of Hari's, one. Secondly, I'm here perhaps in some kind of role as a person who archives and works with images and archiving. Now, what I take away from this book was actually something that is so crucial to the story that we've been hearing about, that a very thriving community which left their trace on so many parts of the city, its built fabric, its educational institutions, its the church. So among, as you say, they're a founding community of the city. This is not a history that we are automatically aware of, but we come to it. So I was surprised, like Yael, to know there were so few, because the presence is so strong, you automatically think there must have been several thousands of them. And even now, you realize the numbers is often what is not really what determines the presence and the importance. And so they were there more than in numbers, they were there through their social, their commercial prominence, clearly, real estate, schools, education, trade, in different things. And the Jewish community may be much larger in numbers, but their presence is almost equally felt. Now, in terms of, I felt that at the time when this project is unfolding, the numbers had dwindled to almost nothing. So I'm thinking, I look back this morning at an essay on the Armenians that featured in a book on Calcutta in its centenary year 1990, written by Jaya Chalihan Banigupta, where she mentions then around 300 Armenians there. By the time Alakananda is working, she mentioned 150 maybe, and that includes the boys of the Armenian college who stopped coming during it. So it's really about vanishing numbers and a vanishing presence. So to me, what the book does through images, through archival documents, which are meticulously photographed and placed, is create a sense of trace and residue. So I think on one hand, a disappearance, on the other hand, an effort at retrieval, not as documentation, because as you say, the archive is small, it has to be searched out, and a lot of it is elsewhere. What remains are memories, as Murray Stephen talked about, families which have memories themselves are fading, but there are these little nuggets in the book. And what I took away is, of course, beautiful photographs of rituals and people, but of the smallest of objects, visiting cards that she uses, the shellac. And I know from Alakananda she went all the way to Ranchi, to the factory to trace the shellac. Now none of this is necessary if you think of it, but it is what the residue and the trace is what I take away. So she wanted to find out about the materiality of the production of shellac. So there's a little object of a piece of coal that she then digs out to think about the Armenian and their investment in coal, their investment in shellac, in indigo. So it are these non-human objects, traces, that I think permeate the book. Yes, there are places like Bada Bazaar, the Armenian Ghat, the Holy Church of Nazareth, which are very important, the Armenian College. But it's the smaller things that she then literally turrets out, and they find a place. And they, Hari, she and I had conversations that moved from Cafe Coffee Day in Gold Park to our house. And I cherish that visit from her when we sat talking. Hari kept giving her more and more and more references. And I could see that that was as disconcerting to her as the lack of material. This was not a historian's book, nor was it setting out to document or tell the long history of the Armenians in the city, say a project that a historian like Shantanu would do. His work was in Madras, in Hyderabad, elsewhere. Perhaps, I've always told him, is to come to Calcutta, less with the archive, but with precisely the trace and residue that we talk about. So I could see the tension between having more material, reading Shushil Chaudhuri, reading articles in Bengal past and present, pulling out more and more material, including the Armenian question paper of Calcutta University. What Alakananda does with it is make it a part of a book in different ways, in ways that I don't think Hari as a non-visual historian could ever have imagined. Alakananda tells me that had Hari written the main essay for the book would have been a different one. But the book as it exists has an intimacy. If you think of all the research that went into it, I had imagined a thick book, a large book, as photo books are. I had thought of more text and information. When this book came to me last year, it was a discovery for me because I savored the book in a very different way. Perhaps as it was meant to, I was enamored by her voyage of discovery, her personal voice, very poetically put as in her encounter with Armenian Street, with the thing. But I see the book as carrying that element of a lingering trace and residue. So the photograph is part of that trace. To think of it, a photograph, all theorists tell you, is as much about representation as it is about authentication. That it carries a trace of what existed before it, right? So the photograph itself becomes a part of the visiting card that was photographed, a part of the robe that may be hanging, a part of an incense lamp. But along with the photograph, each of the archival objects take on that life. And I think the intimacy of that encounter is not that of a standard historian's book, though I feel as historians, I've been always pushed to think about the limits of the archive and what may exist, all the absences in the archive, that other things may tell you. Equally, all the absences in what we are looking for that sometimes an archival information can give us. That back and forth is important. But I also feel that as a person who just came, not as a historian, not as a photojournalist, not also as as an insider wishing to retrieve a full archive of disappeared memories, which Yael has done, both insider and outsider. I think Alakananda was playing different roles here. Her roles may have been changing through this period, and she has already referred to that. And I think what she's produced is perhaps one of many beginnings that others could take off from here. So there is much here that one can read and unravel many, many more stories about. I had many questions, and I realized many of the pictures don't have captions. You are meant to savor them in a different way, just like a beautiful photograph of a person sweeping the courtyard of the Armenian church. Okay, just removing leaves from it, or a piece of shellac in a glass case, a burning candle, a document. And then, of course, there is the bounty of family histories, those photographs that have come in. So I think I'd like to just end what I'm saying with contrasting extinction with trace and residue. The book is both about extinction and disappearance, and it is about holding on to what remains, but without saying this is all or this is everything. There can be much, much more. I'm sure there's much, much more that she herself has uncovered. But she kept the book to a kind of minimal level. It could have been much larger. It could have been more lavish. The fact it is not, I think, speaks a lot about the spirit of disappearance and what remains. And I think that is something that I take away from the book as an archivist, as a visual historian too.
Do we have time for a few questions? I feel like the past time, but perhaps one or two? One or two, if there are any questions.
Very quickly.
Hi, this is a fascinating chapter. It is a fascinating journey that you try to reach out to us through your book, which we still haven't seen. I have one small query question. I heard about the Jewish presence, the Armenian presence of Kolkata, but how much do they interact with the Bengalis of Kolkata? Is there any Bengali photograph in your photograph? Thank you.
I think
This is not a question.
this
This is more, I think, like a question for the both of you. What she's asking is, was there any interaction with the Bengali community?
I want to just tell a tiny story because I think it's more about Bengali community. Yes, there was a lot of interactions with all communities, at least between the Jewish, Armenian and other communities in the city. We shared festivals. We shared, for example, in the big BNLI's factory, they celebrated Durga Puja and they are celebrating Jewish festivals. And during Durga Puja, the Jewish people, even though we're not supposed to, bend before idols, would go be part of the celebration, and they would come to our bar mitzvahs and other things. So, and Armenians, friends and things like that. But I just want to say something, because it's more than just about Jews and Armenians, but basically I want to talk about Calcutta, because Calcutta embraced us in a way that we've never faced anti-Semitism. They faced a genocide, they came here and felt welcome. I'm going to give you a tiny story. When I came home in 2009, I wanted to see the Armenian church. I knew Armenians I'd been to their school, I hadn't been to their church, it's just next to our synagogue. So I told the Muslim caretaker in our synagogue, please take me, show me the lane I want to go to the Armenian church. So he came with me to the Armenian church, and there was the caretaker over there, and I went in to look in the church, and I came out and he was talking with the caretaker. So I said, this is such a beautiful church. And he's saying, the guy, but our church is bigger, it's more beautiful. So then he said, no, but you haven't seen inside, we have all these ritual items. And these two, one Muslim, and I don't know what he was, but they were not Armenian or Jewish, were boasting about the churches that they look after. Now for me that was very moving, because what does that tell you? They embraced us as one of theirs. It became his girja and his girja. And I was the bystander listening to two arguing, and then I told our guy, Masood, uska bahut sundar hai. Just leave it alone. We don't have to compete. But I think that's important, because I think that we could only flourish because we were embraced. And I think what was so beautiful of Calcutta in the past is that we all accepted one another, like we do still today. We celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Durga Puja, they used to celebrate Jewish festivals, and there was all kinds of accommodations. We lived in the same buildings, we lived in the same homes, and I think that as much as we flourished, it's because of the warmth, generosity that this city continues to have, which I think is distinctive in India.
And I remember in school we only had Bengali teachers. Those years from Armenia we had no students. We had from Iran, we had from Baghdad, and some from Kuwait also. Okay, this is no, Armenian college. I'm talking. No, your school was no, Armenian college. Yeah, my aunt went to Pratham. Yeah. So we had only one Armenian teacher. Her name was Oriol Rose Amin Khanyan. She taught us Armenian language, classical Armenian also, and then we had a priest. The priest was teaching us, would teach us. The priest would come from Beirut, from Lebanon, from Beirut, because from Armenia, that time it was under USSR. Nobody would come from Armenia in those years. And we had all like Mr. Banerjee, we had Mr. Chatterjee, we had Mr. Sarkar, then we had Amarendu Das. He would always say, my nephew, which is Jyoti Basu, he'll be the next chief minister of West Bengal. And he was a history teacher, and what was he? A history teacher. Yeah, he was a history teacher. So like this, we only had Bengali, mostly Bengali teachers. I don't think we had Hindustani teachers, mostly Bengali. Yeah.
We had one more question from somewhere here. Somebody had raised up. Yeah. So we'll take this question and then we'll wrap up.
We are talking about the city, but when I was in Murshidabad, I saw this beautiful Armenian church, and it's a hostel where the caretaker told me that they do come down for some festivals, and the image of Mother Mary with baby Jesus, it's one of the most beautiful I've seen, because it's integrated, like it's made of mud, you know, it's not like an opulent. It looks very local, so that's what I found nice about it.
I visited that church once only, because when we were young, we had to take the train, the local train, to go there. And it was an overnight journey, my parents wouldn't take us. But then one year, the Armenian church organized the bus. I don't know whether Bache, you were here that time. They organized the bus to take us. It was a 5-6 hours journey, going one way and then coming back. It was it's a beautiful place, yeah. And Chinsura is every year. Once a year in January, they take us. Those years also when we were small, we had to go in the train. And the whole bogie was full of Armenians. And what fun we would have, you know.
And I have walked along, by the way, on these trips.
I think a small anecdote to share too.
So just to say that this metaphor that was so beautiful in Alakananda's description of a first encounter with the dying, trades in Armenian street. She said a door opened and a word mutated inside. I had a similar experience. We were returning from Chandanagar, where Hari was very closely involved with the French Institute. We'd taken along a friend who studied trade, and we were returning, and normally the stop at Chuchura or Chinsura would be the Dutch cemetery, or we would go and see the Imambara or something, in the Hooghly Imambara. Suddenly, Hari and Kumkum said, you know, there is an Armani Para here, and there's an Armenian church, and Armani Kala, and we'd never seen it. So it was late in the evening, and from the main circle at Chuchura, we went looking for it. And literally in the middle of a very densely built Mofussil town with flat bodies everywhere, there was this like a large enclave with a big gate. And we know there is no entry. We know that we cannot walk into any Armenian church, just like we can't walk into a synagogue. But Hari used all his resources, and he was a person with amazing resources. He stood there and phoned the head of the Armenian church in Kolkata and said, I'm here. Can you please ask the guards to open the gate? And they did. And it was like a wondrous place. So in the middle of Bara Bazaar, you have this place like the Armenian church, which is a discovery. It's a place of quiet. It's like a retreat. Similarly, it was this still beautifully maintained place, fully locked up, which they opened up. And they mentioned that the only time we open up is during Armenian Christmas, when the boys from the Armenian college come. So we were going at the end of December, and they said, come back on the 6th of January, it will be open. We couldn't go back. And it is there within the church that I discovered the grave of Joseph Begler and realized that he was an Armenian. He was Beglerov. I worked on the history of archaeology, and I was told that while Cunningham returned with his small archaeological kind of helpings from all the sites, Begler remained in Hooghly, built his house there, which was full of artifacts and archaeology. I had no idea he was an Armenian. And I know that Begler went half native, whatever it meant. And I think that story remains to be told. And somewhere with Shantanu's help, who knows the language, who can tell me more, I'd like to return to this figure of Joseph Begler, Beglerov, who played a very, very important role in the history of archaeology. It was a discovery, so when I think of worlds mutating, I'm reminded of that late evening in December 2008, when I discovered a bit of an Armenian presence that I would not have known about.
I will probably not be as fascinating as ma'am, but I have this habit of going on pilgrimage in all the cities that has an Armenian church. When I go to Madras, I make it a point to go and visit the church there. I went to Saidabad and made it a point to go around and find out what the church was, and then coaxed and cajoled the caretaker there, who is a Bengali gentleman, to open up the gates. I went around. So every time I do this, the best anecdote was about obviously the Chinsura church. When I got down at the magistrate's office, which is the more, and I did not know which direction to go, two kids took me, who went to the gate and then came back. So it struck to me, okay, this is like a selfish giant's garden. But then I realized that this is the claim on the space of Calcutta that the diaspora still holds. So even if the community in Calcutta dwindles, we also have to keep in mind the idea of circulation. The diaspora is constantly circulating. They come back, they visit, they go back, they pay, the money remits all around. So I think this also has to be kept in mind. The circulation and the remittance. I think that keeps the community alive even when the number dwindles.
That's a great note to end on. I welcome all of you, those of you who will want the book. You can purchase the book here. even if you don't purchase the book, I would say maybe this is a great way to go and discover all these places which are within the city, and so many of us don't know about it. I certainly didn't. So I wish you luck with that, and I hope you join us for a little bit of coffee and some snacks in the cafe, and continue our questioning there if required. Thank you so much for coming, and have a great evening.